Hello everybody, I'm sitting down with Kyle Higgins, the writer of Power Rangers from the beginning all the way up until Shattered Grid. So specifically we're going to be talking about the Power Rangers run today. But yeah, thank you for joining me. How are you?
I'm good, man. I'm good. This is fun.
Yeah. Honestly, the whole Power Ranger series was something that's been on my radar for a long time because everybody will not stop recommending it to me. So when you slid into my DMs to tell me that you watch one of my videos, I figured I had to cover something. So this was a great opportunity. And honestly, I have fallen in complete love. This is one of the best books that I have read in a good long while, and it is super enjoyable, and it's a big burst of nostalgia from when I was a kid.
Oh, thanks, man. That means a lot. Yeah, it's funny. One of your videos on the Marvel DC miniseries popped up on my YouTube algorithm one night when I was watching TV, and I really liked what you did with it. And then I saw you on Twitter and you followed me, and so yeah, I figured. I always love hearing when people people like my work, especially people if I know them or I'm aware of them. It's always nice to hear. So try to pay that back whenever I'm able to.
Well, awesome. Well, I'm definitely an even bigger fan of you now that I've gone complete ham with Power Rangers. So,
well, I'm glad you didn't hate the book.
Oh, no.
That would have been the
honestly,
worst.
No, I don't think that would have been possible. But tell me about your involvement with the series, because I'm not going to deny, before I went into this, I got a little worried about my interview questions. So I went and listened to every interview I could find on YouTube that you've done about the series. And I really want to hear about, I believe you mentioned that you were interested in writing this book for Boom around 2011, before they even got the license.
Right. Yeah. The quick story is that in 2011, 2012, somewhere in there, I was writing Nightwing for the New 52, and I was messaging with a friend of mine, Bryce Carlson, who at the time I think he was an editor at Boom. Now he's one of the head honchos. He's I think he's the managing group editor or vice president of editorial. I don't know what his actual title is, but he's more of a decision maker now. But at the time, we were just kind of chatting on Google, on GChat, and I said, you know what Boom should do? I don't know how Power Rangers came up, but I was like, you guys should get the license to Power Rangers, because it's a brand that's never really had anything that was aged up before, and without having the limitations of having to work with Japanese footage and write around things and all of the kind of pitfalls that the show had 20 some years ago. You could make a really cool modern day superhero series. I could just see it. It was man, you could do this an X-Men or Teen Titans type series and really just build it out. And he was it's funny you say that. He's we've actually been talking about that. So we just kind of went back and forth about it a little bit. And Bryce and I actually went to college together. We didn't meet until the year after college, but so we go way back. And so then a few months later, I'd forgotten about this, and a few months later, Paper Cuts announced that they had acquired the license for Power Rangers. And so I was I guess it wasn't that serious, whatever interest, Boom had, and, I just kind of forgot about it. And then fast forward 4 or 5 years, and I was walking on the sidewalk. It was a few weeks before San Diego Comic-Con. I was getting ready to go shoot a new film of mine, a short film called The Shadow Hours, that I was writing and directing. And I'm walking on the sidewalk, and this press release pops up that Boom Studios has acquired the rights to Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. And accompanying the press release were the first, I think, maybe 5 covers that Goni Montez did of all the helmets. And those images totally cemented it for me. I was like, they get it. They absolutely get it. This could be a hip, slick, sleek book, very modern and contemporary. I mean, when I've talked to Goni since, years later, just about his inspiration for those covers, he's I wanted the Rangers to look I wanted them to look like brand new cars, shiny and kind of glistening and just very sexy, And honestly, it was those images, those first covers, that on the spot, I emailed Bryce and I said, hey, congratulations, this is awesome. I figured they already had their creative team lined up, because usually you don't really announce a book if you don't have the creatives on it yet. But it does happen. And, you know, at this point, they were announcing right before San Diego Comic-Con that they, you know, they had the brand deal. So I said, who do I have to kill to write a pitch for like a, you know, like a backup story? And I was like, I hope it's not you, because you're the only one over there I know. You know, I knew a bunch of the Boom people just kind of socially from doing conventions and things like that over the years, but I wasn't close with any of them. And Bryce wrote back a few days later, and he's like, you know, funny enough, he's like, we're still looking for a main writer, and your name has come up. I was like, well, we chatted about it years ago. He's like, I know, that's why it's come back up. And he's like, would you want to work up a pitch for it? And I said, okay. And I was looking at my schedule, and like I said, we had like, I want to say like a week, maybe we had like 2 weeks before San Diego. And then after San Diego, I was going to go direct this movie. So I had this like little week period where I decided, okay, I'll write a pitch for this. And it was essentially what became the first year. Well, it was supposed to be the first 12 issues, but it ultimately became the first 16 or 17 because we did fill-ins, and then things took longer, and I found stuff that I was really interested in and I wanted to just kind of expand on. And it was kind of the Green Ranger Year One direction. But I laid out in that pitch document, I laid out the first arc culminating with this creature, beast. Ultimately, it turns out it's a Zord, but you don't know that comes into our world from kind of beyond wherever. And then the battle facing off with that creature in the second arc. And then that would tee up a third arc. And in that third arc, I knew that was going to be kind of the culmination of Tommy's introductory story. I didn't want to do new origins. I was really interested in jumping into the book. And if Power Rangers was always about the strength, the friendship, and teamwork, I thought it'd be interesting to explore that idea through the lens of a new member joining the team.
Yeah.
How he feels about being a part of the Rangers, especially considering he just was trying to kill them for like a week when he was brainwashed. And also, how do they feel about him? And to me, I went, oh, that's a story, like that's an engine I understand, especially as a way in. And so we get to create all these dynamics. We get to deal with Tommy's kind of insecurities, etc. And then ultimately, when you do this third arc where he's facing off against his, kind of his greatest fear, in overcoming that greatest fear is when he starts to feel more comfortable, like, oh, I guess I can do this and I do belong with this group. And so building out, and this part didn't happen until a little bit later, as I was breaking, more of the actual issue by issue story. The greatest kind of like Black Mirror is this alternate future timeline where he never turned good.
Yeah.
And that ultimately became the seeds for Lord Drakkon and the Coinless, and then that built eventually over time into Shattered Grid.
Oh, and I definitely want to talk more about Lord Drakkon and Shattered Grid, because Shattered Grid is probably like the single greatest Power Rangers story ever. Granted, I'm a bit of a Power Rangers casual, but that's at least what I've heard down the grapevine, and from what I've read, it's phenomenal. And of course, Lord Drakkon has become an instant fan favorite. But what was it like working with a pre-established property like Power Rangers, which has just decades and decades of lore? Okay, I guess 2 decades, 2.5, of lore, and just a bunch of ravenous fans that know literally everything about it.
Well, it was challenging, and I guess a really good kind of introductory moment for me to the fandom, because I didn't know much about it. I mean, I watched the show as a kid. I loved it when I was about 8 years old. I kept up with it until, probably like a year and a half, 2 years in. It felt like more because that first season in particular was like 65 episodes or something. But I was also the tail end of the age range. So it was really, really popular in my class for about 6 months, and then became very unpopular, kind of like overnight.
Overnight, yeah.
But all my friends who were my sister's age, like 3 years younger than me, or even like a year or two younger than me, they stayed with it longer. So I always had kind of eyes on it from afar. And but outside of that, my only kind of understanding of that fandom and that world was from doing some kind of YouTube interview deep dives in college, like, one night staying up till 2 or 3 in the morning going like, whatever happened to,
Oh, I
and
love
it was
those
like,
rabbit holes. That's my bread and butter.
yeah. And it was like the first year that coincided with like the first or second year of the Power Morphicon convention. So there were all these interviews with former cast members and things like that. But that was it. I saw people cosplay as Power Rangers at comic book conventions, so I was aware that there were still, fans, especially older fans of the franchise. But that was kind of it. So I was at New York Comic Con. I've never told this story actually. So I was at New York Comic Con in 2015, and my now ex, but at the time girlfriend, who had never gone to a comic convention, or maybe I think she'd been to San Diego before, but like we were both in New York together. Coincidentally, we'd only just started dating like a few months earlier. And so we got to have like this magical like week in New York together early on in the relationship in the fall. It was like awesome. And so she comes to the convention because I'm going up to do this Boom panel. It's my first panel with Boom. And the whole point of the panel, before we got to the Q&A with the creators, Philip Sablik was giving this speech about inclusion, about the power of inclusion and diversity and things like that. And the first question when they turned it over, it was by the way, great presentation. It was about kind of the nature of storytelling as well as an art form. And it was really fascinating for me. And the first question up was from a gentleman. His name's Eric. I think it's Eric Francesco. He writes for Inverse, and he goes, this question's for Kyle Higgins, and the whole point of this panel, as everyone's been discussing, is about inclusion and diversity and things like that. And with Power Rangers, I'm curious what your thoughts are, considering the Yellow Ranger is Asian and the Black Ranger is Black, and is that something that you're going to address? And I'm on my first panel for this brand, for this publisher at New York Comic Con, in kind of a packed room.
Question.
And I look up and I make eye contact with my, at the time, girlfriend, and her eyes go wide, and and mine are equally as wide, because I don't know how to answer this question, because. And honestly, I started talking for a second or two, and then I just stopped myself and I said, you know what? I said, I'm going to be totally honest. I don't have a good answer for you. Like, I'm aware of that. Yes, I'm aware that that is a thing that happened. But at the same time, when I was a kid, I didn't think anything of it. Like, I just thought Walter Jones was the Black Ranger, and Tui.
Oh no! The commenters are gonna go crazy. Thankfully, I just binged your entire series. I know it's
I think
Trini.
it's Tui,
I don't know her last name.
It's Tui Trang is the actress's name.
Oh, the actress
was Trini, and so it's Trini Kwam, or Kwan is the last name. I'm sorry, commenters. It's been a few years since I worked on the book, but I said I knew that they were these different colored Rangers, and I wasn't aware of some of the kind of, racial stereotypes that have become associated with something like that. And I said, so, it's something that I'm aware of, but I don't have a great answer as to, if we're not going to change the Rangers' colors, most likely. I mean, especially not with an issue number 1.
Yeah.
And that is a component of working with an established brand, right? And then a few minutes later, there was another question that asked me, a member of the audience asked me who my favorite Power Ranger was. And I said, totally kidding off the cuff, I said, well, the Green Ranger, obviously, because he's the best one. And I checked Twitter like 30 minutes later after the panel ended, and I had gotten completely blown up about, and I didn't realize I was wading into these waters of, everyone has a favorite Ranger and things like that. So it was a very quick kind of introduction to the property and the fandom. And along the way, I learned a lot. And actually, it was my relationship with two gentlemen that developed early on as well. And we work together to this day, Michael Basudel and Matthew Groom. Matt and I are co-writing Ultraman together right now. And Michael runs the Ranger Danger podcast that they both co-host. And we started doing these kind of monthly, basically director's commentaries on each issue. We would get on we would record a podcast talking about each issue. And we just became really, really good friends. And Michael in particular was very tapped into kind of Ranger fandom and that community. So I was able to learn more and ask questions and get more of a lay of the land of that world. And yeah, it was a really unique kind of era of my life. But we got a Lord Drakkon helmet out of it. So
yeah, absolutely. So what was it like to work with Saban Brand? Like, what was their involvement? Because, I mean, obviously, whenever you're going for like a Marvel and DC, you're only going through one layer of editorial. But for this, I mean, you have this large company and their brand that they want to keep in check, but also, you have to answer people at Boom as well.
It's interesting you phrase it that way, because in some ways, my time at DC, in a lot of ways, my time at DC during the New 52 really prepared me for doing something like Power Rangers, because especially at that time at DC, there were several layers of editorial. And so you'd be working with your direct editor, who may not even be the group editor of the core, whatever group the character you're working on falls under. My time there was like, Mike Martz was the group editor in the Batman line. And then I was working with Bobby Chase initially on Nightwing, and then Brian Cunningham on Nightwing, but Mike was running that line, right? So you would get notes from your direct editor, and then Mike would weigh in with kind of overall, as the head of the Bat Group kind of notes. But then there were notes that would come out of nowhere from way up high, from like the editor-in-chief, the executive editor, up to the publisher. And it was a very stressful time to try to create, especially as a new and a younger writer. But having gone through that experience and kind of navigating the politics, as well as kind of all of the different kind of creative executives that were weighing in on stuff like that, really was a nice kind of primer for doing something like Rangers, where on the editorial side, it was, especially initially, it was Daphna Plebin, who runs the books to this day. It's one of my favorite, maybe my favorite editor in comics, definitely my top 2 or 3. Love her to death. Daphna, and then Alex Gaylor was the assistant. And that was it on the editorial side. So it was a very tight group, the 3 of us, kind of building out this book. Bryce would weigh in sometimes, etc. I'm sure, the editor-in-chief at Boom, etc., would probably weigh in, but I never heard any of that. It was just me, Daphna and Alex, and Daphna and Alex really had my back. They got what I was trying to do. They were a great sounding board. Daphna's fantastic with story. And then it became, but the variable there was, as you say, the Saban side of things. So on the Saban side, a really interesting thing happened very early on with the book. The way that licensed comics work typically is that they're kind of an endeavor of consumer products at whoever the licensor is. So, like, for example, if you're going to do, if you want to do comic books set in the Alien, universe, 20th Century Fox, usually like consumer products, will license out that franchise to a publisher, and then consumer products. And I don't know if this is the case on something like Alien. But yeah, like consumer products will kind of like keep tabs on what you're doing, but like no one really cares, like at the end of the day, because what you're doing isn't canon, it's offshoot kind of storytelling. And so initially with the Power Rangers book, it was an endeavor run by consumer products. But when Boom really started putting muscle behind it, and then everyone saw the sales numbers on issue 0 and then issue number 1, issue 0 sold like 130,000 copies.
That's a lot.
No, I'm sorry. Issue 0 sold like 70,000 and issue 1 sold 130,000.
Interesting.
So as that was then going on, Melissa Flores and Brian Casantini, who ran Story and all things Power Rangers at Saban, they stepped in and they had eyes on everything.
Sure.
And then Haim would see things, but Haim was not involved.
Okay.
So it became this process of not only conveying and showing them the vision for the book, but also teaching them how comics are made. So when you're working with a studio that makes a TV show, for example, they give TV notes.
Yeah.
And there can be rounds and rounds and things like that. In comics, there's no time. Like turnarounds have to be like that.
Yeah.
And also the thing about comics is that creators don't get paid for revisions or for rewrites. We don't get paid for outlines. We get paid once for one draft of a script. And then we do revisions because that's just kind of what you have to do in a work for hire situation.
Yeah.
So it was a process. But like I said, having gone through kind of the DC of it all, there's a great quote that I heard Paul Dini say one time. Well, actually, I heard it from Dustin Wynn, who Paul said it to. Okay. But if I asked Paul, I'm sure he would say it to me as well. But there was a situation on a comic book one time where Dustin was like CC'd on these emails, and there were notes that were being passed to Paul on the script, and Dustin's just seeing this as an observer because he's drawing the book, and he's going, oh shit, how's he going to do this, And Paul just wrote back like, okay. And Dustin emailed him on the side and was like, dude, like how do you do this, And I think he may have even emailed him after Paul sent in the revision, which somehow made all the notes work without breaking the core of the story.
Wow.
And Dustin asked him about this, and Paul, incredible writer, definitely one of my kind of idols, and wrote on many, 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 many established brands across mediums over the years. He wrote back and he said, "There's always a story out," meaning like there's like you pick your hills, you pick the battles that are really important, but everything else, there's always a way to do it. There's always a way to kind of give them what they're asking for, even if they don't know that that's what they're asking for. It's the classic kind of note behind the note.
Yeah.
So what was really great about working with Saban was that they really, really cared. And I've said this before, but it's incredibly rare based on, what I've just described as far as the dynamic with licensed comics usually is. It's very, very, very rare to work on a licensed comic that becomes forward-facing for the brand proper. Like, that doesn't happen.
No. So
on the one hand, it may have been more work and a longer process, and it definitely may have burnt me out, especially by the end of Shattered Grid. But it was totally worth it because I'm very, very proud of the book, and we got to do something that, not only the Power Ranger community, but the people who ran Power Rangers were very supportive of. And so, yeah, that was a super long-winded answer to your very easy question.
Hey, but it's very insightful stuff, because I think you're right. Like, this kind of thing doesn't really happen that much with licensed books, and it's incredible that it just ended up becoming a huge deal in the Ranger community, and like you have definitely left your mark.
Well, thank you. That means a lot to hear. It's not something that you think about a lot. I mean, I don't think about a lot anyway. I mean, as any sort of writer, you're kind of your own worst enemy. And I think literally right before we got on this Skype call, I think I tweeted something like, at the point in quarantine where I'm not sure if
I read it.
I'm not sure if I hate myself or the world more. Honestly, it could go either way. That's kind of the nature of being a writer. But every once in a while, Ryan Parrott and I talk about this a lot. Ryan's actually been one of my best friends since college, which makes it very awesome and ironic that he runs the books now after me. but we talk about it a lot, that it's like every once in a while, someone will bring something up to be signed or something, they'll say something, and you'll have this kind of like momentary out of body experience where you realize like, this was a thing. I'm not saying Power Rangers as a whole, but I'm talking specifically about, say, a comic book, for example.
Yeah.
You go like, this is a thing that did not exist before. And this was an idea I had in a coffee shop or in a bar or at dinner that I said as a joke to Daphne or to a friend or to whoever. And now it exists. And it didn't before. It was just an idea. And that's actually really, really cool. You know, like that's the thing that definitely every once in a while like makes me smile and makes me feel really happy that I get to do stuff like this, you know?
Yeah, well, let's talk about probably the biggest contribution, because Lord Drakkon has become a fan favorite character, and he is definitely the standout from your series. Like, even somebody who hadn't read the series prior, I knew about Lord Drakkon. He is that pervasive. So what was the inspiration behind that character?
Lord Drakkon was an interesting one in that it wasn't intentional, and I wasn't looking to build a character to kind of, you know, pop, for lack of a better kind of descriptor. But it's also true, like, you can't pick your hits, you know? So as I was kind of talking earlier about just the genesis of that initial 16-issue storyline, I knew that I wanted to end the first, you know, year of Tommy's story and the Rangers with him feeling fully accepted and a part of Rangerdom. Mm-hmm. And that meant conquering, facing off against his greatest fear. And that greatest fear is, maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe I'm not up to this task. And I thought it would be an interesting opportunity to personify that through the lens of a character that is himself, that never turned good. He actively chose to stay evil and side with Rita. And look, I mean, I'm a sucker for dystopian, you know, alternate future timeline stories. And to my knowledge at that point, I didn't really feel like Rangers had ever really done something like this. And again, because it's a comic and we're not having to work with pre-existing footage, like the sky's kind of the limit there. But it has to come out of character and kind of an emotional core. And so that was the emotional core for me. But the intention was always going to be that it was just an evil White Ranger. So when you reveal who's actually piloting the Black Dragon and pulling the strings, it was just going to be the White Ranger. And I just thought like that was a really awesome kind of like, what the hell kind of inversion. And as we got closer to showing him for the first time, a note came down from Saban that they wanted us to basically create something that was more ownable, like an original character, an original Ranger. And so I remember I was in Paris of all places because I had gone through like a really, really bad breakup. And I did the super cliched thing where like I had nowhere to live. So I put everything in storage and was like, I'm just going to go travel for a while.
Yep, been there.
Yeah, so I was in Paris sitting in this like little cafe where I spoke no French and they really didn't want to speak English. And I was getting these emails because of the time change from back in LA going like, hey, here are some designs of this new original character, and how do we make this work and make sense, etc. And suddenly I'm like having to catch up, and I'm figuring out like, okay, well, he has the white light, but I understand that canonically the white light is kind of like power of good. So the question was like, so how can he have it? And so my answer was that he actually has it in conjunction with the green energy or whatever it's called. It's weird because you say like green power or red power or, you know, things like that. But I have to stop myself every time I go, he has the white Yeah, no, that's not. It's the white light. That's, I'm not looking to start anything here.
We're not going to get you canceled on this interview, I hope.
Yeah. So it was the Green Ranger kind of power energy and the White Ranger power energy, kind of at odds with each other. And so they're in a state of conflict at all kind of times. And so that's where you get some of like the veins and things like that on Drakkon, that those ended up being like really important for Saban, to allow us to push this kind of across the goal line. But as you can see in the book, like as we went further and further, like I didn't do anything with that. Like it wasn't a thing. Again, pick the hills that are important to die on, and that was not a hill that I felt like was worth, fighting over. And so Jamal Campbell did this amazing design, and he did a lot of rounds of revisions on it. And I think in one of the hardcovers you can, or in the trade paperbacks, you can see a bunch of different alternate designs he did. And then it came down to me to name them, and I knew I wanted to do Lord. It was going to be Lord something because I wanted the Lord Zed. I wanted I had also done very subconsciously, but you'll appreciate this. And I don't know if you've put this together yet on your own, but now once I say it, you'll probably never look at this stuff the same way. I had done a trial run of all this stuff without realizing it in the Justice Lords Beyond story that I wrote for Batman Beyond 2.0. Like down to there being a giant statue of the Green Ranger and Rita, whereas there was a giant statue of like Lord Batman in the Justice Lords world.
I didn't put two and two together until you mentioned that.
Totally an accident. Like I remember as I was building out this coinless story, again, I was also going through a breakup, and I remember writing this stuff going like, oh, this is really cool. Why, this feels familiar. And I couldn't place... So this happens with writers sometimes. You do sometimes repeat yourself, especially in monthly comics. Like,
sure,
you're just writing so much material. So I like to look at... I only realized it years later when I went back and looked at the Batman Beyond stuff for some reason. And I was like, oh, wow. Like, there's quite a bit of crossover. Mm-hmm. So, and I think there was the Justice Lords and Lord Batman. So I'm sure that was rattling around in the back of my mind as well. But yeah, so I built out, I was going to be Lord something, and then I just spent this morning in a coffee shop back in Illinois, just trying to come up with iterations of Dragon. Like I knew it was like, well, the Green Ranger, the Dragon Zord,
right.
Dragon, Draconian, Draco, Drakkon is what I ultimately landed on. And we threw in an extra K to, again, make it ownable.
Yeah.
And that's really where he came from. But the thing that I always found amusing and still do to this day is that we debuted him on a page turn splash reveal in issue 9 of the comic book. And people were really excited about this. Like it made some news headlines and people were talking about the design a lot. And this is a testament to the fact that a character popping, I really feel like it's probably like 90% the design. Like think about the characters.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, think about Venom. Think about some of these characters. Like Venom's a cool idea, but that design is so stellar,
Yeah, we've been seeing that a lot in like Marvel Comics with like characters like Gwenpool and Spider-Gwen. Before they were even characters, they were designs, and they absolutely popped off.
The designs are great. Yeah, the Jamie McKelvey Captain Marvel design. I mean, obviously Captain Marvel was around way before
that for sure.
Suit that he designed, but it was so iconic looking, and so it's a testament to Jamal's design. But what was really weird was that I had this story in mind for Drakkon, and I had this idea that across the entire multiverse, he was actually the only Tommy that never turned good. And it created an inferiority complex in him. And I knew all this, but we hadn't done any of it yet. And so the idea that the character was popular and I hadn't done anything with him, even after the first storyline, he's just a tyrant in issues, 11 through 16?
Yeah, I want to say so.
Yeah, there's not much going on there character-wise. It wasn't until Shattered Grid and you start to pull back the layers and reveal like, oh, he's posing as other versions of Tommy to just try to figure out, why do people like him? Because he just sees weakness, That to me is interesting. But, he was already, early on, it became kind of clear and cemented in my mind that he was going to be the villain for Shattered Grid. And luckily, because of kind of the how much he cut through kind of like the Power Ranger nostalgia cultural zeitgeist, it was an easy sell. So it was one of those kind of just really fortunate turns of events, I guess.
Well, that actually leads in really well into my next question is what was the idea behind Shattered Grid? Like, how did this come about?
Well, early on when I was pitching on the book and I was talking to Bryce about it, he was actually talking about all these exciting possibilities that Saban was open to, including alternate timelines, and an event. And when Bryce broke it down, it was like, if we do, year one, it runs through, this point in time, and then year two could be building to an event in year three. Because year three he'd figured out year three of the book was going to coincide with the 25th anniversary of the TV show. And I remember him telling me this, and I was like, oh, cool, yeah. And I had only written like the first like 2 or 3 issues yet. And I remember thinking to myself, like, there's no way in hell I'm going to be on this book in 3 years. Like, there's no way I'm going to write 3 years of Power Rangers. And then as we amassed more and more issues, and I started to really find my footing and figured out kind of my broad scale scope of what the series could be, that's when I was like, okay, yeah, like year 3 event. I mean, honestly, that was the other thing, the other way they got me, just I guess a little behind the curtain, was that I'd never run an event before. I'd been a part of a lot of them at DC, but Scott Snyder ran all the Bat books, the Bat events that I ended up being a part of. And so I learned a lot from him, but I also wanted to really try my hand at something like this, And so when they told me like, yeah, we want to do an event in year 3 and like, we want you to creatively run it and we'll have tie-in books and we'll have this and that, I was like, really, So that turned out to be, it was a lot of work, but it was an amazing opportunity. And there are all these side and ancillary things tied to Shattered Grid that we did. There's a second series. There's Go-Go Power Rangers that, again, one of my best friends, Ryan, writes. And we would talk about this all the time. Like, can you believe, like, we get to run an event? Like, we've been talking about this since college. Like, how crazy is this, And so we broke a lot of stuff together and just gave each other story pieces and bits so that each other, like, there was no ego there, like we were trying to support each other. And then, I directed the big live action Shattered Grid promo film with Jason David Frank. And I structured that to exist in between issues of the comic book. And then I helped on the Hyperforce RPG episodes. Like, I gave them some story threads that I knew I wasn't going to be able to do anything with in Shattered Grid, but they could also loop back in and fit within the canon of the event that I was writing. Well, let me put it this way: if you're gonna bake a cake, right? There are certain things that have to go into a cake, because otherwise it's a pie, right? Sugar and flour and frosting, and and you can play around with the different amounts of those ingredients and throw in a few extra things, etc. That's what makes a cake unique from other cakes. But at its core, there are kind of like foundational, baking ingredients that you have to use to make a cake. A comic book, a summer event, is kind of the same thing. Like, it has to be large enough in scope to support other ventures, other storylines, things like that. But it should also be able to be read on its own without having to go down, the rabbit hole of tie-ins and one-shots and standalone stuff. So from a threat standpoint, I knew that I wanted existence to be at risk. I also knew that I wanted to figure out a way that I could bring in other Ranger teams. And so that meant figuring out a way to kind of break time and space. And so then from there, you can start to see how the name Shattered Grid came about.
Yeah.
How, the metaphor of, our world and time and space existing on a pane of glass and breaking and you can break a piece of glass and it can retain its shape, but spiderweb cracks will start to spread, and eventually the whole thing will just collapse. And so that became, again, the kind of the backdrop, the impetus for the story. And then from there, the Drakkon motivation of it all, and wanting to, because of this inferiority complex, wanting to become one with the grid and basically become God, was something that I felt, I could get behind this from a narrative structure, standpoint. And then from there, it just becomes about like figuring out, okay, where are my set pieces? And Lord of the Rings was a big influence for me too. And I would comp a lot. I'd be like, okay, but I need my Helm's Deep. Like, where's my Helm's Deep? And that became the Battle of Corinth and things like that. So these things do tend to kind of like build on themselves as you get going, or they do anyway for me.
I want to talk about a couple of the things that have kind of spun out of Shattered Grid. And you mentioned it earlier, but that the live action promo that was done with Jason David Frank, it's so rare that a comic book gets a commercial or a trailer these days. So what was that like? Because you got to bring in some of your directorial background in this as well, but also clearly this was something that Saban was into, because they were putting some pretty like high budget stuff. Like, you got the original Green Ranger to come in and do this. What was that whole process like?
Well, it was me and Jason. It was our idea. Jason had been hitting me up Jason and I were good friends at that point, and he had been talking about like, dude, like, I'm doing these conventions, everyone's talking about Lord Drakkon, like, we got to do something with Lord Drakkon, we got to shoot something with Lord Drakkon. And I was going like, yeah, but I can't do a fan film or something like that. Like, I'm writing the official book. Like, I don't know, I don't know what we could do. And then I had the idea of like, I just saw it all at once, like hearing the voices of Rangers past and using existing footage as an opportunity to celebrate 25 years of Power Rangers, but also show this existing footage like they are other worlds, or at least other eras that he's tapped into observing. And then the reveal, like, I saw it all. Then it became a process of actually convincing everyone to let us make it. Boom was totally on board. There were people at Saban that were a little hesitant, but ultimately they came around and they were incredibly supportive of it. And we shot it in a day, did all the post on it in about 3.5 weeks. The whole short is 11 shots only, and I think 10 of the 11 are VFX shots. So it was quite extensive. I reached out to Ron Wasserman, who had done the music on the original show, and then had, he did the theme song, Go Go Power Rangers. He did the theme songs for, I know he came back, he did SPD. But anyway, he's very iconic within that world as well. And so he scored this promo for us. We dropped it like a few days before the book the first issue of the event was coming out. So it was a ton of work, but like, it was like super fulfilling, super worth it. And it was a blast to work with JDF. He was really happy with how it turned out as well. And like I said, I have an awesome helmet as a result. This is not actually the helmet that was in the short. I got this one after the fact from Anarchy, but Anarchy did build the suits and the helmet
cool
that we used for it. And so Jason's actually got all that stuff in Texas.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, outside of Shattered Grid, the book, Battle for the Grid came out.
Oh,
and you wrote for that. So what was it like to have this event that you made then be adapted into a video game? And what was like the difference in writing for that?
Well, that was the first video game I've written. But luckily, because it was structured as a fighting game, it was, there were a lot of kind of predetermined parameters as far as what, how many fights you need to have, things like that. The roster was determined already as well. So there was a day that I flew up to San Francisco with Melissa Flores, who she's no longer at Hasbro, but she was at Saban and then Hasbro, and she ran kind of under Brian Casantini, but they ran everything Power Rangers, and so Melissa flew up as creative exec on the game, and Amanda Cruz, who was at Lionsgate, and she was a producer on the game. The three of us went up to San Francisco to sit down with the Enway team in a big conference room just to go over like story mode. And it was, fairly late in the game, in the development of the game, because this would have been, I think, November of 2017.
Okay.
And the game came out in April of 2018. So it was a really fast turnaround when I came in. And so we went up there and they showed me, first of all, I used to be a fan of a lot of things, and I'm not a fan of very much anymore. I guess I'm cynical. I don't know.
Sure.
Or I've been burnt doing it for a living. Mm-hmm. But I was in their offices and they were walking me down these rows of computers, just kind of showing me all of these people that were working on this game. And all of a sudden I'm seeing things and I'm hearing like names of things that, like someone's talking about, oh no, the Black Dragon, like look, the armor should move like this. And I'm turning and I'm seeing a guy, like he's character rigging the Black Dragon armor with Trini's head in it. That was like 5 pages of the comic. Mm-hmm. Like it was just an idea I had as we were doing an action sequence. And now someone's rigging it for a video game to be playable. And then there's another person over here who has all of these printed out still frames from the Shattered Grid promo film that we did. And he's actually modeling Drakkon's, throne room. And I geeked out so hard. Like it was so freaking cool. And I asked him, I was like, I have a Maya file, like a 3D file. Do you want it? He's like, yeah, that would be great. Because we built the set practically for the promo film. And our production designer, who's an amazing gentleman, Calder Greenwood, he actually sculpted it in 3D first in Maya. So we'd make sure it would fit on the stage and everything. And so then it turned into like sitting in the conference room and going through like the character list and then the skins that would be available for each character, because for the sake of story mode, skins could be extra characters for me as the writer, meaning like Ranger Slayer was going to be playable, but then there was also going to be a Kimberly Hart skin. So to me, it's like, great, I have a Kimberly and I have a Ranger Slayer, character that I can tell a story with. And so like on the spot, it turned into, in front of like this wall of whiteboards, we went for like 6 hours, 7 hours, and I just broke the whole game, the story. And Melissa, and like I said, everyone was there. It was very collaborative. There was another writer there, Heather, who works for Enway. She's fantastic. She's like their narrative lead. And it was a lot of me asking questions like, well, is this possible? Like during this fight in the foreground, could there be a Megazord fighting a giant Goldar or a whatever in the background, just to give the illusion that we're in the midst of this massive war at Corinth, right? Things like that. Figuring out how many cinematics do we have a budget for that I can actually write cutscenes, At that point, there were no voices planned. So it's like, is it all going to be text? Like, how is this going to work? And then I'm basically kind of writing animation where I'm doing camera moves that I'm able to use the same artwork, but just pull back to reveal a new layer of a character, right? Things like that. And luckily, because I had written the comic, a lot of the heavy lifting I had already figured out. Right. So it wasn't a case of like, well, does this idea work? Does this like create more story problems down the line? It was like, no. I've already kicked the tires on this to death and proofed it out as a book. Now it's about figuring out, okay, with the ingredients I have here, how do I can't make the same cake, but how do I make something that at least evokes a similar taste as the cake that we made in the book? And so that was a lot of fun. And it was like a really cool I felt, I'm not gonna lie, I felt a little bit kind of like a badass, like just kind of like off the cuff going like, well, no, we break it here, and then over here it'll be this. And, you know, it's not like I'm not a savant or anything like that. It was just, I already written it. You know, I wrote the book. I knew it really well. And Melissa knew it really well. And so we were able to kind of, you know, reverse engineer things and whatnot. And then fairly late in the production of the game, we decided to do voices. And so that became a task for me and Melissa to figure out. And we reached out to a lot of the actors that we had relationships with. Mm-hmm. And then I voice directed the game. So wow. I voice directed a day session in LA with everyone except for JDF. And then I actually flew to Houston, and JDF and I did 8 hours the day before a convention.
Right before a convention, Jesus.
The day before. He was a pro. Like, he was killer. And not only was he doing Drakkon, but he was doing Tommy as well. Mm-hmm. You know? And so I've only played the game once, and it was like recently during quarantine for Melissa's, she does some live streaming Twitch stuff. But I actually haven't seen it all. So the cinematics of the first part, I was really involved in the editing of them, and I was doing some recutting and things like that. But the second half, I don't know if I've actually seen them. But I was really proud of everything as it was coming together.
That's really awesome, and a great use of all of your different disciplines coming together.
Yeah, it was cool. And anytime I get to do stuff like that, I actually I sleep better at night, because it's like, I've wanted to make movies. I've been making movies since I was 7 years old. And the comic book career just kind of happened. But I only ever wrote growing up, especially, so I would have material to direct. And then it just so happens that this film I did in college kind of took off for me. It was a big superhero noir, and it ended up being the inspiration for the book we did years later called Cowl. And the editor-in-chief of Marvel saw it. I was like 22, 23 years old. And I started pitching to Marvel for like a year and landed this Captain America one-shot. And then once you get one of those, it's easier to get the next one. And then DC poaches me to come do Batman stuff. And it's like, I'm 25. I mean, you can see the giant Nightwing poster behind me there. My all-time favorite character that to this day is probably my favorite comic book run, the Chuck Dixon, Scott McDaniel book. And they give me the keys to my all-time favorite character, 26.
Yeah, he's my second favorite character. So like I'm geeking out about your time on Nightwing as well.
And so it's just one of those things where it's like, well, I guess I'll go do this. Like, I actually quit. I was working as a sound editor in Hollywood, and I quit to go write Batman because it's not what I wanted to do. And so, you know, I still want to direct. I actually have some features coming up that, if the world restarts, are potentially really, I'm very, very excited about. And so any opportunity for me to like get away from, you know, typing day in, day out, I'm like very excited by, you know, even if it's sound editing and motion graphics and stuff like that. Like, so this game was, to your point, like a really great kind of use of some of those other skills that I don't get to dust off too often anymore.
Well, I think we've gone through pretty much all of the questions that I had. I mean, you also answered a lot of the questions that I was going to ask, just conveniently. But I was wondering if you'd be interested in doing like a lightning round with some viewer questions.
Yeah, sure.
So a lot of people wanted to know who your favorite Power Ranger is and your favorite Power Ranger series. I know you mentioned that it's the Green Ranger because he's the best. Do you still stand by that?
You know...
You can also say Lord Drakkon if you want, or Ranger Slayer.
I can what?
You can say Lord Drakkon or Ranger Slayer if you just want.
Oh yeah. I mean, yeah, Drakkon's pretty cool. No, I was a big fan of, and it kills me that I just couldn't figure out a way to work them into Shattered Grid in a more prominent role. But I really like Jungle Fury, and their mentor RJ. Is like, I just think is an awesome character. And again, there are like a few panels where he's in there in Shattered Grid, but I just couldn't, you know, the thing with an event like this or any sort of crossover, it's more about the illusion of arcs than anything, because you just don't have the space to give everyone their due. So instead what you do is you create moments that feel really resonant. And for example, like Andros and Corinne, that is a moment that feels like there's a bigger arc behind it than there actually is. So for those who don't know, Andros is the Red in Space Ranger, and the villain of the In Space season is this character, this woman named Andromeda. And what you realize as the story goes on is that she's actually Andros' sister, but she's been brainwashed and she's a villain. So his whole motivation, the entire series, is about saving his sister. Well, he ultimately does, spoiler alert. And then the next season, it's a new cast, and it's the Lost Galaxy Rangers. And the actress who played the Pink Ranger got sick in real life. And so they had to I shouldn't say recast, but they brought in a different character to take over the mantle of the Pink Galaxy Ranger. And so they brought Corone, because she's been redeemed, and now she's the Pink Galaxy Ranger, right? Well, because we're dealing with time travel and Shattered Grid, I had this idea, which was, what if Andros meets Corone, but they're at different points in each of their timelines? So he hasn't saved her yet, but she has already been saved. So when they see each other, he just breaks down crying, and she tells him, "You saved me," you know? And it's this moment, I get kind of goosebumps even just talking about it. Like, it's this moment that, as long as I did set up so that you understood who Andros was and you understood who Corone was, you don't have to have seen any seasons of the show for it to emotionally make sense. And so an event like this is filled with those kinds of moments. And I didn't have anything for the Jungle Fury Rangers, unfortunately. But the long-winded answer is RJ and Jungle Fury.
Well, that actually ties in nicely to New Super Rander Man, who wanted to know if there were more things that you wanted to do with the series as a whole, and if so, what are they?
Well, there's a couple things, actually. The first is that there was this whole subplot that I had envisioned, and we just couldn't get it across the plate because it created a lot of questions for some people on the Saban side. But in theory, most of what you see in Shattered Grid is actually only our world. Drakkon's world is a different universe. Our world is broken as a result of Drakkon killing Tommy and the other kind of, permutations of events that are happening at the same time. It's not just killing Tommy, but it breaks our world so that every era of Rangers exists all at once, right? But there's also an entire multiverse out there, not to mention all of these pocket eras that now exist all at once. And this is a long-winded way of saying that, like, there are, in theory, an infinite number of Tommies. And for starters, I had zero interest in, like, doing this big story with all these Tommies teaming up to fight Drakkon. Like, I have no interest in that. But what I did have interest in was actually showing Drakkon's inferiority complex as he goes through different eras, and every time, and we kind of got to do it once when I did the Zeo story in the annual, where he kills every time he comes across, because he just believes, like, I can't be the flawed one. It has to be everyone else, And that was an idea we just weren't really able to do much with. And because, again, it created this, like, question of, like, well, wait, what do you mean there can be all these Tommies? It's like, well, it's time travel, like, it's thematically resonant, like, it's coming out of character, but the best I could do was showing, like, one, I can't remember if we do it more than once, but we definitely did it once with the Zeo story in the annual. So there's that. And then the other thing, I mean, I'm probably not talking too out of school here just because it's the regime change. There has been a big regime change in the last couple of years, and I haven't been on the book in a couple of years now.
Yeah.
And, my time with Rangers is pretty much done. But we did get, decently close to doing a live action series. Like
really?
We were talking about coming off of the Shattered Grid promo film and then also Shattered Grid proper. I was talking with them about doing a story in the world of the Coinless. And, a lot of the actors, not to say we would have been able to get everyone back, but a lot of the actors are the right age now. Jason, David Frank really wanted to do it. And all of that story, none of it would have, I'll put it this way. It wasn't necessarily a direct prequel to like Shattered Grid, but it happened. Nothing in there would have invalidated the comic either.
Sure.
So it was its own thing, but it did not invalidate the story of the comic either. So it was kind of a prequel, I guess, in some ways. But the cool thing, and I hate prequels, but the cool thing about it was that we were going to do things in it that were very different from what you thought had happened in the past of the world of the Coinless and things like that. I was really excited about it, but didn't work out. Hasbro bought the brand, and then everything kind of went on hold, and then ultimately just didn't happen.
Sure,
but that would have been. That's the big one. That is my man, what could have been kind of feeling. So,
well, that actually ties in pretty nicely to Fresh Prince Relaire, who wants to know if you were given any input on the writing from any of the original actors.
No, I mean, I became friends or friendly with a lot of the actors, but no, not really an input. There were things that I kind of, as I got to know certain people, just doing conventions and things like that, and a lot of the actors were very, very supportive of the comic book and very complimentary. And it was a nice kind of, in some ways, it was like, it's kind of a cool self-perpetuating thing in that, a lot of the actors do conventions and they get to meet fans and they do autographs and things like that. Well, here I am writing new material that features their characters, or characters they played, I should say, which then a lot of fans bring to them to have autographed. So it becomes this kind of like interesting kind of feedback loop in some ways. So every once in a while, like an actor would give me an elbow, and be like, so is so-and-so, is they going to show up pretty soon? Can I get a cover? But all in good fun.
Sure.
But there were things that, like, as I got to know certain people, there were things that I just, as, kind of as a writer, I just kind of observed about different dynamics and things like that, where I think in the back of my mind, it informed a few things, or a few story ideas, or, personality, things. But yeah, nothing I could really speak to, like nothing too direct.
Honestly, most of the questions that were sent my way have been answered throughout the course of this entire interview. So I guess the last one I really want to ask is from General Binks. Let's get away from Power Rangers for a bit. He wants to know what some of your favorite comics are. I know we already mentioned that Nightwing is your favorite character, but anything else that you're a big fan of?
Well, I mean, this interview might go for another hour once I say this one. I'm currently on volume 12 of Invincible, which I had never read before, and I've read all 12 volumes. Hardcovers, by the way. I'm not talking the soft covers.
It's so good.
I'm on issue like 130 right now, something like that.
Oh.
And it is...
So you're when they're in space?
I'm in what?
So you're whenever the series goes to space? I think it was at 125 is when that happens?
It's been in space for a while.
Okay, it's been a while since I've read it.
Yeah. Mark and Adam Eve and their daughter have been living on the planet where the Coalition of Planets
Hell
leadership
yeah.
run by Alan is set up shop. But no, we're getting into, I can feel it. Like we're getting into the end game now.
Oh, you wait. I am so excited for you to read it.
I know.
It's a roller coaster that only goes up.
I've been telling people, a few people recently, and screw it, I'll just say it. I've said to Kirkman recently, I was like, this is so refreshing and exciting for me. I just thanked him. Like, I have not been a fan of something in so long, and to find something that I could immerse myself in, and an entire world, and just the feeling of every hardcover feels like a community. Like it feels like you get to the back matter stuff, and it's basically a verbal chat between Robert and Ryan Otley and Corey Walker. And it's been such a fantastic reminder of why I love comics. And I know that sounds really simple, but it's something that you forget. It's easy to forget, especially with the world as it is right now. And, I've been writing comics full time for 10 years now. And that time just flies by, and you get, it's a grind. Sure, we love books, but a lot of times that love becomes more of an idea than an actual feeling. Like, you love comics, but the last time you were truly excited about something, a lot of times at least for me, like I can't actually remember what it was, Sure, you have the mainstays of your childhood, the Nightwing series and Batman the Animated Series and things like that. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the first movie especially, I'm a huge fan of. Like, anytime something like that comes up, it's like, it's like mainlining nostalgia for me. It was like, I have to have that, or I have to watch that,
Yeah, no,
But as far as, yeah. So this book, so Invincible for me has just been such a breath of fresh air. And by the way, it's really, really fucking good. It's really good. Like, Robert is very, very talented, and there are things he does, and that then Otley and Corey Walker also, it's a collaboration, but there are things I can see it. I can see it on the page, like the way he sets certain things up narratively. I'm very obsessive about page turn reveals, because they're a tool that is specific to the medium of comics, and so I structure all my books. I'm very meticulous about where my page turn reveals happen, because it's about the reading experience. And Robert is a master at them, So it's just been, I could talk about it I could spend an hour or 2 hours here with you on it. But yeah, I love that book so much.
And I know exactly where you're coming from. And obviously, it's a little bit of a different experience on my end, since I just cover comics. I don't actually create them myself. But if I can stroke your ego a little bit, the Power Rangers book has really been that for me. I've been getting really burnt out on comics. I mean, yeah, I love them, and I'm really liking a lot of what I'm reading. But I've been so immersed in them that getting into something completely new out of left field, and the fact that the Power Ranger series was as good as it was exactly the breath of fresh air that I needed. And that's why I was so passionate about getting this interview and the 2 videos that I'm putting out together.
Oh, thanks, man. That remember when I said earlier, like every once in a while, like you have kind of a slight out of body experience where you realize like, oh, yeah, I made that. I just had that. So thank you, because it does, especially coming right on the heels of me trying to articulate why Invincible resonates for me so much. Like, to think of the perspective that something like my Power Ranger stuff could do that for someone else is like, that's really cool. So thank you.
No, you're welcome. And let's end things off by talking about some of your upcoming projects. You mentioned earlier you're going to be working on Ultraman for Marvel, which is very appropriate given your history of Power Rangers.
I mean, there is a reason I got the job. So, it's funny because I started at Marvel back in 2009 with this editor, and in 10 years, I've done like 6 books with him. Like, that's it. So he actually reached out to me, Tom Brevoort, towards the end of last year, and he was like, hey, totally, kind of taking a flyer here, but do you have any sort of affinity for Ultraman? And I was like, I mean, I like him. Yeah. I mean, I don't know that much, but I do like him. And I guess behind the scenes, they had, Marvel was aware of what I had done on Rangers, and they were talking about how they thought, it seems like Kyle gets tokusatsu and kind of what makes it unique. And obviously I adapted it's weird. I haven't adapted tokusatsu for Rangers. I have adapted an adaptation of tokusatsu with the Power Rangers book. But through that, I was exposed, actually thanks to Matt and Michael. Again, I was exposed to Sentai, I was exposed to Kamen Rider, some Ultraman, and it's been so much fun. And the thing I'm most excited and proud of is that Matt Groom, during our time talking about Power Rangers for the Ranger Danger podcast, and then just talking off air on GChat pretty much every single day, I came to learn that he wanted to write comic books. He didn't say anything to me for like over a year. And then I was like, what, he showed me something finally. And I was like, where did this come from? I was like, do you want to write comics? He's like, it's the only thing I've ever wanted to do. I was like, how did you not say anything? He's like, well, I don't want to be that guy. And so I actually helped put together what became his first creator-owned book at Image. It's called Self-Made. And I served as editor, and I found the artist, and I brought in the letterer, and then the artist brought in the colorist, and then we put together the package, and I brought it to Image, and Eric Stevenson greenlit it. And so coming out of that, Matt and I did a one-shot together at DC, and so for the Dark Multiverse last summer. And so when Tom emailed me asking about Ultraman, one of my first questions back to him was, would he be open to me doing it with a co-writer? Not saying that was the only way I'd be able to do it, but there's this new writer who I met during Rangers, and he gets tokusatsu, and I really think he'd be a great additive value here. And on top of that, he did a book at Image, and he and I just co-wrote together at DC. So it was like, we could not have been more teed up, because that's a big ask when you're asking an editor if you can bring on a partner. And so it's just gone swimmingly well. And awesome. We've written the first 5. The first 4 are approved. We're doing some reworking on issue 5 now. But we're very excited. Francesco Manna is doing the art. It looks spectacular. He's really leveled up. And it's just, again, it's a really cool opportunity to come to a property with a very passionate fandom, and hopefully bring something new to the table that is also respectful of what came before. So a lot of ways I would say, like, if you liked what I did on Power Rangers, I think you're really going to like Ultraman. And I actually think our Ultraman stuff is even more ambitious than what I did on Rangers. Yeah.
Wow. And any other creator-owned stuff that you have in the pipeline?
I do. It's funny you say that. I have a couple. None of them are announced yet, but there's one in particular that it's not a coincidence that we'll be announcing and bringing it out after Ultraman.
All right.
So if you look at the trajectory from Power Rangers to Ultraman to this, I think it'll make sense.
Okay.
And there's a lot there that if you liked what I did on Power Rangers, if you like Ultraman, but more importantly, if you like awesome modern superhero stuff through the lens of tokusatsu, or I should say, there's some tokusatsu influence. I think you'll be excited about my next creator-owned book.
Well, I'm excited to hear more about it when you're actually able to talk about it.
Yeah, me too.
Well, I think that's about everything I had to say. Kyle Higgins, thank you so much for sitting down with me. This has been an absolute blast.
Oh yeah, my pleasure, man. Anytime.
All right. Well,
We'll do it. We'll do it next for Batman Beyond.
Absolutely.